first of all, I want to thank Max and Dimitri for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here back in Tel Aviv. It's a deja vu for me because I went to the political science department here in Tel Aviv and they changed my life and they told me that I should go get a PhD in America. So it literally changed my life. So I'm really excited to be back here. I'm a political scientist, and I mostly study international norms of transitional justice. And I'm really delighted to come after Or, who prepared the ground, so all the definitions are out there. I don't have to do those in my presentation. In this paper, there has been a widespread, almost consensus, that among conflict resolution practitioners and scholars, that there are indeed long-term positive effects for what we call dealing with the past by historical acknowledgement. Historical acknowledgements are practices that attempt to come to terms with historical grievances, usually following violations of human rights, in non-monetary means. So, and the argument, so they are assumed to lessen the effects of contested history. They assume to lead to reconciliation. We discussed a lot of reconciliation here. They assume to utter regret and build together, foster a better future. This article actually flips the arguments and actually says that they're not only useful if and when they lead to reconciliation. I would leave that as an open question, if they lead to reconciliation. But because we think they lead to reconciliation, they're actually quite useful in early stages of conflict negotiations. So in a way, people don't like those. The reconciliation people don't like to say that there is instrumental use of those strategies. But it relates to the historian presentation we had in a previous panel, that there are actually quite pragmatic solutions in negotiation settings. What they do, they address the long-term distrust, which is usually an underlying cause that hinders negotiations, and they provide what we call in conflict resolution literature positive costly signals, and I explain soon what they are. So this is the argument, and what I argue that this argument was not always true. It's true specifically time because in the current international environment, we actually have what we call a normative international environment that supports those measures, that supports the introduction of human rights concerns and transitional justice concerns into negotiation. Just think about what's happening now with the Palestinian and the human rights discourse of genocide in the current conflict. Okay, so this discourse of human rights is very much part of our conflict now. Okay, so this is actually a published paper which is made of two things. It's made of theory development, which I built on models of conflict resolution and conflict transformation literature, and on models of negotiations. And then on the empirical side, I do what I call a feasibility study of the Israeli-Palestinian context, specifically the issue of the 1948 Nakba. In this presentation today, I will focus only on the theoretical model of the theory development. So transitional justice, as Or presented, we have a field of study of transitional justice, which refers to a range of practices that address the negative psychological, social, and political effects of past injustices. These include trials, human rights trials, reparation programs, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That we have a whole toolkit of what we call transitional justice practices that attempt to address the legacy of human rights violations. In the literatures, transitional justice practices have been associated with multiple positive effects. Like in social sciences language, the dependent variable were many. It promotes democracy, it promotes reconciliation, it promotes peace building, it promotes, there's numerous dissertations, all of them show a different dependent variable. Historical acknowledgement strategies are a subset of transitional justice, and they refer to the non-monetary means or the non-retributive means, which means we exclude trials, we exclude reparations, and we focus mostly on truth and reconciliation commissions, like the one in South Africa, for example, that ended apartheid in the mid-90s. Historical narrative revisions, for example, what has been done in Germany, the fact that every German student has to study in the curriculum the history and the legacy of the Holocaust in history in schools in Germany. Official apologies, as was described here, and public commemoration. So basically changing the environment in a way that commemorates it. So think about the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, for example, that commemorates the Holocaust, and think other things, basically renaming spaces, creating national memorial holidays. All those things are part of historical acknowledgements strategies. Now, in the conflict resolution, going to the conflict resolution literature, there is this idea that indeed adversaries usually tell the history differently. Reverend Mason just mentioned the diverging narratives of the Irish conflict. We call it the War of Independence. Palestinians call it the Nakba. So the diverging. So sometimes even the contested history itself becomes a significant obstacle to peace and conflict. Just think about, what is Crimea? Is it Russian? Is it Ukrainian? They're fighting over the history of that in a way. Furthermore, there's this idea that distorted self-glorifying narratives also shape perceptions and intentions of threat. So studies show the more the there is a distorted view of history, there is more threat perception among adversaries. So basically, in the conflict resolution literature, the idea was that historical acknowledgement strategies have the capacity to produce a joint narrative and therefore to legitimize peace agreements and to legitimize living together in peace. The conflict transformation literature has been even more specific and suggesting a more substantive role to historical acknowledgement. And what they argue is that it vindicates victims, it alleviates their sense of being hurt. It's a mean to kind of create trust, respect, cooperation. So basically, for example, the one example that is really given is the Belfast Agreement in 1998. So basically, that in the agreement, there was those clauses about peace-building measures that will transform the conflict. Yes, we agreed, we achieved the political agreement, but now we have to move forward into achieving a societal agreement, and that will be by reconciliation. So both in conflict resolution and conflict transformation literature, these practices and strategies have been typically associated with a bottom-up process and left to the domain of civil society. So this idea was that, yes, even in the example we saw in the previous panel about those German-French exchange program, it was this idea that after the rapprochement between Germany and France, there will be these exchanges in the education system, and they will build friendship between the German people and the French people. We saw that in the previous. In fact, conflict resolution experts often said, leave it to the later stages, because if we will raise those issues of history at the beginning of negotiation, it might lead to a backlash, an opposition. Instead of fighting about the agreement, we will fight about the Nakba. So let's just not discuss that and move it to later. Okay, so overall, it was usually discussed in post-conflict peace building, basically by civil society, and often assumes some level of political closure as a precondition. So as I said, I would like to change that, to change the timing and the level of analysis, what we call, and basically focus it as a short-term negotiation dynamic and focus it as negotiation strategy by the negotiating leadership. So yes, there is some recent literature, especially on what we call during conflict justice, which really talks about what does that mean to introduce them during negotiations. And there's a lot of they talk about indeed the mutual recognition. So the theme still persists that the focus is on the psychological, what we call emotive effects of mutual recognition. This idea that it will have some kind of a psychological effect. So basically lead to some kind of transformation of identity. Okay? I would argue that you don't even need to focus on identities, okay? Just focus on the dynamic, little micro dynamic of a negotiation. And this comes from models of negotiations that are strategies of positive inducements. So basically, the argument says that even if you, as an actor in negotiation, initiate unilateral, some kind of positive measures, they tend to be reciprocated. So it is in your benefit, if you're a negotiator, to show some kind of positive measure in your approach. And so basically it comes from this idea that you can try and move the negotiation from a zero-sum game to a positive-sum game. I can offer you more things. And in this way, actually, historical acknowledgement strategies are becoming a new trade-off, something that I bring to the table. I will educate all the students in my school system, my public school system, in your history. Think about it, I'll give an example. Think about the outroar here in Israel recently about UNRWA and about the content of textbooks teaching malicious images of Israelis, okay? So think about the commitment for an Palestinian curriculum which teaches the legacy of the Holocaust. Okay, so basically, and commit for that in your negotiation process. There will be something you put to the table, you offer as a concession, okay? And it's not something so far-fetched. We've seen those examples actually in many places. In South Africa during negotiation, we all like to look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa as a miraculous way which prevented the violence and ended apartheid. But if you go and look at the micro foundation of negotiations, it was a political compromise. Basically, the ANC wanted a trial. The Clark said, no way. And there was like actors from outside which came and offered this idea, okay, we'll do this quasi-legal thing, which does nothing, but it will do a lot of reconciliation, okay? So we have extension, we have the Good Friday Agreement, as I mentioned earlier, and we have the Long Peace Accord in Sierra Leone, which ended the civil war in Sierra Leone in a similar way. During the negotiation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was proposed as a concession, as part of negotiation. So we do have a support for that. Another thing which we do is, well, we can look at that as addressing the problem of trust and costly signals. So that's another way the strategies work. So I mentioned the unilateral reciprocity. The other thing is what we call the signaling hypothesis. And this is a very common hypothesis in negotiation models in international relations, not of historical justice, but in general. The idea is that negotiations are a very high risk, low information, incomplete information environment. The actors kind of hold the cards close to the heart, so there's very little information going there. So the question is, and you have two actors that really distrust each other. Think about it. They're in a conflict, they're killing each other. So, okay, so what can you do in this situation? So our argument here is that historical acknowledgements are signals of commitment for long-term coexistence. I'm telling you now, listen, I'm going to change my textbook. I'm going to build you commemoration sites for your Nakba. I'm going to build you, so you can provide weapons to Israel, but you can also, I'm going to go to the Warsaw Ghetto and kneel down and apologize. Adenauer. So, yes. So think about those signals of historical acknowledgement. And these signals actually follow what we see in the signaling theories. They are a way to tie your hands. So, for example, a signal will be more costly if you can reassure the other side that it's not going to be changeable so easily. Tying your hands. So the way to do that, as I said, is with long-term commitments of this kind. We also know from the studies that positive signals are actually more effective than negative ones. So basically, carrots are more effective than sticks, usually in those kinds of negotiation. So historical acknowledgement strategies are basically an endorsement of public commitment to accept and acknowledge the other. And this commitment really is profound, because if you tell that you're going to teach your kids the history of their adversary, you're basically telling them that you're creating a generational change for the future. So it's the most commitment that you can actually signal to the other side. It's also in a way to reduce threat and to provide a diplomatic mechanism to build trust. And we actually have quite a lot of example for that. And in my research, I just found it really interesting that Japan, for example, did incorporate, which we often say that Japan is the non-apologizing state. So usually compared to Germany in negation, because they did not apologize for the war crimes during World War II. But actually, during the micro-negotiations in 1956 with Korea, Japanese-Korean normalization agreement, there was elements of regret and apology in the negotiations. So, and the same was true in the 1970s in the Sino-Japanese Peace Partnership Treaty. So we see this kind of dynamic. Two last points. So the one counter argument is it really costly if you just say, I'm sorry, or apologize, or are they really costly, or they're just cheap talk, basically? So I would actually go here on the negative argument here, and I said, think about how countries cares about their historical narrative. To what extent they go not to acknowledge their past crimes of human rights. Think about Turkey and the Armenian genocide. Think about Japan and the comfort women, the sexual assault of women. Think about Austria, that for years had this really strict denial of their being part of the German Nazi machine. So basically, think about countries really care about their history. So my argument is, if they really care, then their signaling of doing the other way will be indeed a costly signal. One last thing to consider is the audience costs. So one of the things in negotiation is that it could be really costly to apologize for past crimes of human rights violation. It's costly because you can have a backlash from your own population that doesn't want to do that. It's costly because it can be a moral hazard. So basically this idea that it signals weakness rather than resolve, and we want to signal resolve in negotiation. And the third, my argument is that these are all true for problems of negotiations. However, historical acknowledgement strategies sometimes are mitigated in those audience costs. And especially, one thing is, in many societies, the history is not really unknown. The history is there. There are academics that have been studying that. So, for example, when President Clinton apologized for Japanese internment during World War II in camps in the United States, it didn't come out of the blue. It came after years of academics publishing books about those camps and everything. So there was knowledge in society. So I would argue that there's not always such a backlash as we would anticipate that there is, because the information is available out there. And the second reason that all this course is mitigated is what I talked about, the international normative environment and its expectation and incentive. So we find in the literature a lot of studies now that in the last 20 years, we have what we call this global historical justice regime, or this idea of norms of dealing with the past. And not only do we have it, they're very commonly entering almost any peace negotiation that is going on around the world. So almost in any peace negotiations, this idea of acknowledging history is entering negotiations. So what this creates is expectations. But I would argue it's not only creating expectations, it's also creating incentives. Because now you can actually get not just identity loss from acknowledging your past history of human rights violation, but you actually can have an international identity gain. I am the country that acknowledges the wrong I've done. Think about Germany and the social capital they have gained by acknowledging their past history. So it actually can add to prestige and reputation and to legitimize the peace agreement. So in conclusion, I would argue that beyond this idea of kumbaya and the wolf lives with the sheep, that might happen with all those historical acknowledgement strategies, what I offer is a pragmatic approach that supports the application of historical acknowledgement in the micro-negotiation strategies. I don't think they should be left for civil society. They should be encouraged by the use of leadership in very early stages of the negotiation. Thank you.
My first question is to you, Michal, and to you, Or. Michal, you just said about Clinton recognizing the war prisoners, Japanese war prisoners. This acknowledgement took place when there was an avalanche, practically, of political leaders, right, yes, saying sorry. My question to you and to Or, was this due to a certain time? Has this period stopped? Can we expect something more? Because all the famous statements were coincided in time at the end of starting from probably from the start of the 90s and up till the year 2000. Do you think it's a question? What is it a question of what?
Yeah, I will take a zoom out for that. So I agree with you. What we have, the emergence of transitional justice practices start in the late 90s into 2000s. And it starts, I would actually think, I'm not sure it was a lot of pressure. My explanation would be more about a lot of entrepreneurial politics. So basically, people who followed what we call the fourth wave of democratization, which is the post-Cold War waves of democratization. And they were professional transitional adjusters who went from many areas of conflict around the world and proposed apologies, truth commissions. So in a different study that I do, I show very clearly the path you have. A truth commission emerging in the 70s, going in a very small path, regular path, and then you have a spike after the South African Truth Commission, and we have up to the data set of Truth Commission today is about 50 Truth Commissions that have been operating, some in established democracies, some in transitioning. Most of them are failing, but they're still being practiced. So to your question, yes, it starts clearly fourth wave of democracy after Cold War, but in my opinion, even now it seems that it's kind of declined. It's actually there because it's part of the toolkit of the UN. the UN has a transitional justice toolkit, which they bring to every conflict around the world now. The International Center of Transitional Justice, a non-governmental organization established in early 2000, in the early 2000s, is one of the leading conflict resolutions organization now around the world. So they go from conflict to conflict and they propose those toolkits to the politicians on the ground.
Thank you.
You've been talking about the conflict settings, and I think it is also worthwhile mentioning that the dynamics of conflicts are very different, whether they are international or domestic. And if you have, for instance, domestic conflicts, you have costs and benefits inside of your domestic sphere. So if you make acknowledgement, if you make concessions, you also have benefits from it because your own constituency benefits you for bringing up the peace. But if you have an international conflict and you acknowledge something, you have costs that are going beyond it. So I'm researching on reparations, so if you have a hammer in your hand, everything is a nail. But if we're thinking about reparations, for instance, the very acknowledgement of something, whatever it is, whatever kind of narrative or part of a narrative or part of a conflict, that can imply liability. And I think there we have something that is not going to be beneficial for your domestic politics. Nobody in your constituency will favor money going to another country, whatever it takes. It's never the case. And so this is something where I would just mention that this distinction between domestic conflicts and international conflicts is very, very important at this point.
I'm slightly different. I do agree. I do think that we all said earlier, the two-level game becomes more acute when it's an international negotiation or international conflict. I'll just take the example of the audience costs, because you do have, when you're doing a negotiation, international conflict. So think about it. We have the two leaderships, right? And each leadership, let's say Netanyahu, has its own audience cost in Israel, and they have the international audience cost. Same, let's say there is a coherent Palestinian side, but if you say Mahmoud Abbas or Hamas as two actors, they both have audience costs, domestic ones, and they have international ones. So I do think that maybe international conflicts make it more complicated, but I think it also changes the opportunity structure because of that. I'm not saying, I don't want to sound too optimistic, because I'm not, but it does change the opportunity structure, because you do have role for international actors maybe to come in more, because it's also within their interests. For example, the greater stability of the region of the Middle East. It is definitely an interest of the United States, as we've seen from the beginning of the conflict, reiteration of the conflict. So, so you do have a little bit, though I think we have more difficulties because of that, but you might have more opportunities or windows of opportunities to use the other actors, other audiences, and use them instrumentally.
Leaders, what to do. And yes, I'm giving you the opportunity. And they know that if they're going to apologize, or if they are going to acknowledge past crimes, they are going to cost them a lot. And there's going to be a backlash, and they won't be able to continue. Would you tell them to look for a bypass? I'm not too stuck to the idea of offering apology or acknowledgement, but look for bypass. Or is it such a dilemma? I mean, in the end, they will come to the same deadlock. I mean, if they won't speak about the past, they won't be able to continue.
I won't be able to offer a generalized answer for that, because I do think that's what the devil is in the details. So each case, I will have to examine the conditions which will make historical acknowledgement strategies more likely. I'll give some cautious examples here in Israel-Palestine, but I'll be very careful and very cautious. So saying that, so think about the Nakba, okay? So is there really going to be such a backlash for that? Okay? Okay. You think so? One would think so, right? Because there has been a lot of, for example, counter movements. If you think about the brochure Nakba Charta by Im Tirtzu, which is the whole document which tried to refute the Nakba, which was published. And if you think about the usage of the term, but I would like to suggest move 20 years before, 30 years before. Anyone knew what a Nakba was in Israel? I can tell you no. I have the surveys. So no one knew even what a Nakba is. So now people actually know what a Nakba is in Israel. They may say, appallingly or not appallingly, what do you think? We should have done a greater Nakba. We should have done of course, it is horrible. It's human rights violation. It's ethnic cleansing. That's the range of views of that. But you have a discourse about it. 30 years ago, there was not even a discourse about it. So for me, when something is part of the discourse, it is opening the way to being used. I'm leaving it at this cautious level here.